Thank you very much. So I guess I'm here to represent money. I think that's really my job. And it's a funny job, my job, because in fact it has two bits. One bit of my job is about forecasting what will actually happen to companies, and the other bit of my job is the world's most postmodern job. So it's about telling people nice stories and convincing people of stories, and usually quite simple ones. And it turns out I've been rather successful in the last few years, that's because my job's been very easy. And my job's been very easy for the simple reason that I've just consistently told people not to buy any of the telecoms companies. And that's been a wildly successful call. So I'm going to start with three facts. And they're kind of important, I think, if you're trying to figure out how to get money into the sector and what to do with the CEF in order to make my life much more complicated, frankly, because I might actually have to tell people to buy some of these things. And so the three facts are this. First of all, investors are willing to spend 2 times as much for €1 that's generated in a US telecom than they are in €1 generated in a European telecom company. So that's a pretty remarkable difference. The valuation gap between the European telecoms and the US telecoms is absolutely enormous. Guess what? The American companies are investing an awful lot more. They also have enormous access to capital because capital is flooding into those companies. Second fact is that I think that the job of investors, and indeed of people like me, is often misunderstood. And you need to think about this when you think about who you are giving your money to, if you have any, and you're fortunate enough to have a pension to invest. Because, in fact, the job of most people who invest money is not to make money for you. The job of most people who invest money is to avoid losing your money. And it's a very important difference. Because what that means is that you have an enormously asymmetric view of the way you consider growth and the way you consider loss. And that's actually true of all of us. We all have an endowment. We all endow things we have with much greater value. And that indeed is one of the problems in dealing with the European telecoms operators, because they will have a whole bunch of stuff with which they endow great value, and probably erroneously. So it's quite important that if you have a very asymmetric view of growth or loss. So that's the second thing that you need to think about when you think about how to get investors to come. And the third thing, and this is the reason that it's been quite an easy call, is that the return on invested capital of the European telecoms operators and the sector on the whole is several basis points below the weighted average cost of capital of the same companies. What does that mean? That means that if you put money into these companies and they reinvest it in their business, you will have less money several years down the road. So the entire European telecom industry is economically value destructive, which is amazing, because actually it's wildly productive for you if you get them to invest and to make money. It is enormously important for the economies of the countries. So what's very peculiar is that Europe has regulated for a world in which an incremental euro into a telecom company will be worth less in the future, because they are economically value destructive. So guess what? My job's really easy. I go around, I tell people, don't invest in them, they're rubbish. The regulation is terrible, and you'd be much better off either owning something in America or owning something somewhere else, or owning something that's going through some kind of terrible, reconstruction event. But on the whole, it's pretty easy, and it's been quite a good trade. The question is why? Okay, so this is now more important than. So why is it? Why is it that these things are so value destructive? Well, and why is it that the American ones are not? And here there's a funny difference, and the difference is the difference between apple cores and donuts. So, American telecoms companies look like apple cores. Normally, you'd rather have a donut or a bagel, so one with a hole in the middle, than an apple core. But when it comes to telecoms, you'd actually much rather have an apple core. And the reason for that is, what I'm talking about is the fact that the American companies have been allowed to pretty systematically sell off their more rural businesses, which have then gone bankrupt one after another. And it's always amazed me that the American telcos have found anyone to buy these rural businesses, because they just immediately go bust one after another. The reason for that is relatively straightforward. The reason for that is that making a return on investing in rural Europe or rural anywhere is very difficult. Wildly capital intensive business, you put in a huge amount of money, and then, oh dear, there are only 4 people living out there in the sticks to actually pay you anything, and you don't make a return. So the American companies have basically gradually lost all of that lousy rural business and are left with the very dense business, on which you can make a better return, where they have in fact invested. The European companies are exactly the reverse. And the weird legacy of European competition regulation is that all of the European incumbents, which are 85% of the market cap, look like donuts. So they are hollow. And they are often the number 3 or number 4 operator in the most urban places in Europe. Why should you care about that? Well, you should care about that because what that means is that they make a truly disproportionate amount of their money from rural places, where, by the way, nobody can make a case for investment in rural fiber, because it's not possible to make an economic case for rural fiber. The return on invested capital of the final third of Europe is about 2%. Well, the weighted average cost of capital of most of the European companies is for now 8% and rising. So it's seriously economically destructive to go and build fiber in rural places. And that's particularly true because these European companies have a lot more market share out there, and so they really can't make money out of it. So, the problem is relatively simple. It's that the European companies are shrinking, and the question then is, what do you do in terms of regulation, and what could you do with the CEF in order to bring some money back into the sector? Well, the first thing you could do is you could help the European incumbents to fill the hole in the middle of their donut in. And that's actually what the most recent announcements about regulation have basically done. The most recent announcements in regulation have effectively created a world in which you have a huge incentive to build more fiber in the densest places in Europe. Why is that? It's because you'll be able to create cost inflation for your competitors in the densest parts in Europe. So what have we actually done with the changes in regulation? Well, what we've done with the changes in regulation is we've created a huge incentive to build more fiber where in fact there was already pretty significant private incentive to build fiber anyway. So there will be a lot of fiber in the densest bits of Europe. It might be fiber to the node, it might be cable, it might be other things, but there will be a lot of it in that first densest 25% of Europe. So that's part of it, fine, that's, it's a good start. The question then is, well, what are you going to do with the rest? Because the problem is, we had this announcement about regulation. Everybody said this is the biggest thing that's happened. It's the most important regulatory change in decades. Share prices of telecoms companies did nothing. Absolutely nothing. And the gap continued to get wider and wider between the US and Europe. So filling in the hole in the middle of the donut is not enough, because the outside of the donut is still going to be eaten by other competition and regulation. And so the question is, okay, well, how are you going to solve filling in the rest of the donut, and what are you going to do with your money? And here, you actually have 2 quite radically different choices. One is you can say, miserable incumbents, never going to spend money on anything useful. If you give them any break, they're just going to take the money and go and buy something in Latin America. If you take that view, then probably what you should do is you should create alternative vehicles. And the alternative vehicles are going to be vehicles which are going to go after very specific geographic places in order to invest in fiber in places that are just outside that first quarter of the country, just outside the places that the telecoms will naturally invest to. Those are going to be very attractive vehicles, and you will get a lot of private money going into those vehicles, and it will be very, very interesting. Recognize that if you do that, and by the way, the sort of money that you're talking about, this CEF, is potentially really very appropriate for that kind of investment, because it's quite small, specific, very regional investments. And you can get proper private equity money behind it, and that's potentially really very interesting. Recognize that if you do that, you will incrementally hurt the returns of the big incumbents, and you will incrementally reduce the amount of cash that they have available to invest in their existing fiber. So the last thing that I would suggest, and part of my job is convincing people to buy stuff, and so when you do presentations, it's worth thinking about the third option is always the right option. So you set up the first two options, and then you say, well, those are both rubbish, and so here's the third thing that you really have to buy. So the last thing I'd suggest is this. And I think Gabrielle has spoken really eloquently about this. It's the fact that Europe simply can't afford to have network competition, multiple platforms. The reality is there isn't the money for it. So what you could do, in fact, instead, is think about separating the underlying layer of infrastructure and offering RAB-based returns. Now, that's something that's been discussed in various places, and the reality is that where it is discussed, the implications for at least most of the stocks in my coverage are a 40 to 50% increase in the value. In other words, you start to have vehicles in which you can have enormous incremental investment. It is very, very difficult to find a stable investment in the world right now. Anything that is growing is trading at an enormous premium to everything else. And so you have huge, huge differentials in valuations in the investment community. It's very, very difficult to find something that is modestly growing. You don't have to do much, but the reality is you could offer really quite low returns, but stable returns in a separate layer of infrastructure that could well sit within the existing telecoms companies, and that would fundamentally change the amount of money that would come into the sector. The challenge then is, how do you fit the CEF in it? And it may well be that you do a bit of both, and it may well be that actually you start, and what you use the CEF for is to do trials in sub-regions of countries, so that you can get that, you can prove that that model works, and that it is indeed something which brings a huge amount of money into more rural Europe. Because the reality is, if you don't, despite all of the blandishments and encouraging statements of all of the operators, you will have fibre to the first 20-25% of Europe and not much more. Because one of the operators, certainly that I know, and quite a few of them, will say, one set of things clearly to regulators, and then in private will say, you know what FTTP stands for? It stands for fibre to the press. Do a lot of ribbon cutting. They cannot make an economic case for building it significantly out of 25%. So you need to either help them to make that case, or to show them how they can part with bits of their infrastructure in local regions in such a way that they can then do it on a larger scale, and you can actually start to see really meaningful amounts of money coming back into the sector.